December 1st, 1941. The room was a furnace of expectation. The walls thick with the oppressive heat of men who dared not breathe too deeply. A single word from Hitler, one command, could alter the fate of entire nations. The maps on the table before them were drawn in ink and blood, the black lines marking the territories that had been won and those yet to be claimed. The air was dense with cigarette smoke, the smell of leather and sweat. And in the middle of it all stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, eyes fixed on the map, his expression unreadable. Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of iron will. His voice rang out, harsh and commanding, outlining the order that would change the course of the war. "We advance," he said, his words cold and final. "There is no turning back. We will crush them. There will be no retreat." The officers around the table shifted nervously, the weight of their roles pressing down on them. Some of them leaned forward in eager agreement. Others held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Rundstedt stood silently, unmoving, his hands clasped behind his back. He had been in these rooms countless times before, had watched men bow before Hitler's will without question. He knew the cost of defiance in this world. Dismissal, disgrace, perhaps even death. Yet something in the air that day stirred in him a quiet, unshakable resolve. This time he would not obey. Hitler's gaze turned toward him, burning with impatience. "General Rundstedt," he said, his voice laced with command. "You will execute this order. I demand no hesitation." Rundstedt did not flinch. His gaze met Hitler's, unbroken, unyielding. He could feel the tension in the room crackle like static. The men at the table were waiting for him to bend, to bow, to do what was expected of him. But Rundstedt's heart was steady, his resolve sharper than the steel of his uniform. "My Führer," he said, his voice low but clear, "there are no more victories to be had on this path. We are stretched thin. Our men are weary. The supply lines are fragile. We must pull back." The words hung in the air, a forbidden truth laid bare. The silence that followed was heavier than the weight of the war itself. Rundstedt's gaze never left Hitler's face, knowing the consequences of what he had just done. The room was still, save for the ticking of the clock, its sound loud in the silence. Hitler's face hardened, his eyes narrowing into a cold, calculating glare. The officers shifted uncomfortably, some with a flicker of fear in their eyes, others holding their breath in anticipation. Rundstedt stood motionless, aware that his career was hanging by a thread, but not flinching. "You dare to question my orders?" Hitler's voice rose, the fury in his words causing the very air in the room to vibrate. "You dare to challenge me in front of these men?" Rundstedt did not retreat. "I dare not deceive you, my Führer," he replied, his tone calm and resolute. "But the truth is that we are marching toward a disaster. I cannot lead my men into it." Hitler's fist slammed down on the table, sending the papers scattered across it fluttering in the air. "You will obey," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "You will execute my orders, or I will have your career destroyed, your name erased from history." Rundstedt's gaze never wavered. He had known the price of truth in this world. He had seen men fall for far less. But he stood tall, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. "If that is your will, my Führer, then so be it. But I will not lead my men to their deaths for the sake of pride." For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting for Hitler's wrath to crash down. But instead, a strange, almost imperceptible pause followed. Rundstedt had done the unthinkable. He had refused to kneel, to comply, to surrender. And in that moment, Hitler knew he could not break him. The order came down swiftly. Rundstedt was dismissed. Not for insubordination, at least not officially. It was for his health, they said. He was relieved of his command and sent home with his dignity intact. Or so it seemed. The truth was much more dangerous. Rundstedt had defied the Führer, and that defiance could not go unpunished. Yet, to the shock of those who had witnessed the confrontation, Rundstedt was brought back. Time and again, he would be dismissed only to be recalled. There was something in him that Hitler could not ignore, something that defied the very nature of the regime. It was not power, not loyalty, but something far more dangerous to a dictator's ego: honesty. And so, Rundstedt returned. Each time, his position weakened, his influence more precarious, but still his presence commanded respect. He had become a symbol of defiance, not in the form of rebellion or violence, but in his simple, unwavering refusal to pretend. The years passed, the war raged on, and Rundstedt would continue to serve, always standing between the system that sought to destroy him and the truth that would not let him be silenced. He had learned that in a world built on lies, the greatest weapon was not power, but the courage to speak the truth, even when it meant standing alone. Rundstedt's career was marked by one simple truth. In the face of Adolf Hitler's all-consuming demand for obedience, one man chose to say no, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. Gerd von Rundstedt's story began long before the storm of war. It began in the rolling farmlands of Prussia, in a small garrison town where duty and discipline were not just virtues, but the very fabric of life. His family, the von Rundstedts, belonged to the Junker class, the landed Prussian aristocracy. They were not the wealthiest, nor the most influential, but what they possessed was something far more valuable in their world: an unbroken tradition of military service. For generations, the men of the von Rundstedt family had answered the call to arms. Theirs was a legacy written in the ink of history, and it was a legacy that Gerd could not escape, no matter how much he might wish to. From an early age, Rundstedt's path was set before him, carved by the expectations of his lineage. The very air he breathed seemed to whisper of duty and responsibility. There were no choices to be made, no alternatives, no rebellion against what was already decided. He was born to serve. The army was not merely a career. It was a calling, a sacred duty passed down through the generations, etched into the very marrow of his bones. In his world, to wear the uniform was the highest honor, the greatest privilege a man could possess. At the age of 17, Rundstedt answered that call, stepping into the hallowed halls of the Imperial German Army as a cadet. It was the first step in a life he had been preparing for since birth, but it was also the beginning of his immersion into a world that would shape him forever. The army was not just a profession in Prussia. It was a way of life, a culture steeped in precision, order, and discipline. The ideals of the military were the very bedrock of society, and Rundstedt was quickly swept into its exacting rhythms. The training was grueling, demanding more than mere physical endurance. It required an unwavering commitment to the military code and a devotion to the chain of command that bordered on the religious. It was not enough to simply follow orders. One had to internalize them, to embody the very spirit of the military, to become a living extension of the state. Rundstedt learned quickly. He absorbed the lessons of the Prussian officer corps with an intensity that few could match. Precision was the highest virtue. Every movement, every gesture had to be deliberate, calculated. His life was a relentless march of preparation, of absorbing tactical knowledge, logistics, and strategic theory. The military's training system was as exacting as a surgical procedure. It was a world where the smallest mistake could mean failure, where only the most meticulous men would survive. But in Rundstedt, the military system found not only a student, but a natural. He thrived in this environment, the sense of duty coursing through his veins. His world became one of maps, tactics, and endless hours spent perfecting military maneuvers until they became second nature. By the time he was in his early 20s, Rundstedt had already spent years honing his craft. He was not just a soldier, he was a professional. The ideal of the Prussian officer was embedded deeply within him. He would never be one for grandiose displays or charismatic speeches. His world was one of quiet competence, rigorous self-criticism, and an unwavering belief in the value of the chain of command. Rundstedt was not driven by personal glory or ambition. To him, there was no higher calling than to serve with precision, to act with unwavering professionalism, and to lead with an iron sense of duty. It was a world where men memorized logistics tables as others memorized poetry, where the smallest detail was scrutinized, and the ability to move an army's supply lines as efficiently as one could move a single battalion was considered the height of brilliance. Rundstedt excelled in this environment, driven by an almost obsessive dedication to mastering the art of war. For all the nobility of the Prussian officer corps, there was a cold, unyielding sense of duty that often overshadowed the personal. It was a world where the man was secondary to the cause, where emotions were set aside in the pursuit of order and control. Rundstedt was not a man who sought accolades or recognition. He sought to serve, to be a part of something greater than himself, to play his part in a machine that demanded perfection. In these formative years, Rundstedt was not just shaped by his family's expectations but by the very military culture that surrounded him. His service was not a duty he could escape. It was his identity, his life, and it would remain so for the rest of his days. The Prussian officer corps had molded him, and in turn, Rundstedt would go on to embody everything that was expected of a professional soldier. Precise, disciplined, unwavering in his commitment to the chain of command. And though the winds of history would soon sweep through Europe, bringing wars and revolutions that would change the world forever, Rundstedt's legacy was already set in motion, engraved in the strictures of duty that had governed his life from the start. He was no longer just the product of his aristocratic upbringing. He was a man shaped by the military's code, a soldier bound by a heritage of unquestioning loyalty and uncompromising professionalism. For Gerd von Rundstedt, there was no turning back. The war was a hell unlike anything Gerd von Rundstedt had ever imagined. In the trenches of the Western Front, he faced not just enemy soldiers, but the savage, industrialized nature of modern warfare. It was a brutal new reality, one where bravery and courage alone meant little against the immensity of the machine that had replaced traditional battle. The skies above were filled with the constant roar of artillery. The ground beneath him churned with the mud and blood of men who fought not for glory, but for survival. Rundstedt had entered the war as a young officer, filled with the ideals of military honor he had been raised with. But what he witnessed in those hellish trenches shattered the romantic notions of battle he had grown up with. The war was no longer about grand maneuvers or heroic charges. It was a war of attrition, a test of endurance and resourcefulness. Armies no longer fought to break through lines with sheer force. They fought to outlast each other, to wear the enemy down through supply lines, logistics, and timing. It was not just about willpower. It was about systems, and in the world of modern warfare, those who mastered the systems ruled the battlefield. Rundstedt's observations during the war would shape his entire understanding of military strategy. While many soldiers still clung to notions of heroism and glory, Rundstedt came to understand the importance of control over the battlefield, the need to conserve strength, and the logistical intricacies that made or broke an army. This was a lesson in realism, one that went beyond ideologies or the rhetoric of nationalism. It was about survival. On the Western Front, the line between life and death was drawn by the sheer weight of resources. A single shell could wipe out a company, and a single misstep in supply could turn victory into disaster. Rundstedt came to understand that warfare was not a battle of ideals or will. It was a battle of systems. The military's ability to move men and material swiftly, to strike at the right time, and to retreat when necessary, this, not courage alone, would determine the outcome of any campaign. He saw firsthand how the exhaustion of a soldier, the depletion of supplies, or the failure to communicate could grind an army to a halt. The front lines were no longer decided by a general's ambition or personal bravado. They were shaped by the ability to manage resources, to move quickly, and to adapt to an ever-changing situation. Rundstedt's personal experiences reinforced his growing understanding that the ideals of the past, the romanticized notions of military honor, had no place in the war of the future. The military was no longer an institution where bravery alone could win the day. It was a cold, calculating machine where only the most ruthless pragmatism could succeed. He had seen it in the battles of attrition, where offensives often yielded little more than ground soaked in blood and men driven to exhaustion. A single artillery barrage could wipe out hundreds of men, but it could also break the morale of an entire unit. That was when the true nature of warfare became clear. It was about the logistical machine behind the fighting, the one that could keep supplies flowing, troops moving, and the enemy at bay until victory was assured. Rundstedt also came to understand the importance of retreat. He had seen firsthand how the refusal to pull back, the unwillingness to recognize the limits of one's strength, could lead to disaster. The commanders who won were not those who pressed forward at all costs, but those who knew when to conserve forces, when to cut losses, and when to strategize for the long term. There were no sacred grounds in modern warfare. There was only survival, and survival required the ability to admit when the cost of holding a position was too high. Retreat, he learned, was not a sign of weakness. It was a tactical decision to save strength for another day. Rundstedt left the war with a deep respect for logistics, timing, and decision-making. He had learned that modern warfare was not just about courage or idealism. It was about the ability to navigate a complex web of moving parts. Men could be killed in an instant, but wars were decided by who controlled the resources and who could outlast the other side. The future would no longer be won by battlefield heroics, but by the careful, cold-blooded management of resources. The experience of World War I had transformed Rundstedt into a commander who would be marked by his pragmatism. He was no longer the idealistic officer he had been when he first joined the army. Instead, he had become a professional soldier, shaped by the brutal lessons of war. His growing understanding of military logistics over ideology would guide him for the rest of his career, and in the years to come, it would make him one of the most effective and calculating commanders of the Second World War. It was clear to him now. Victory was not just about fighting bravely. It was about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and, above all, when to adapt. In the brutal world of modern warfare, only those who could bend with the tides of battle, who could endure the hardships of the war machine, would ever emerge victorious. And Rundstedt had learned that lesson well. The world that Gerd von Rundstedt found himself in after World War I was one of chaos, uncertainty, and destruction. The once proud German Empire had collapsed under the weight of defeat, its aristocracy in disarray, its military broken. The Weimar Republic was born out of defeat and humiliation, its fragile democracy struggling to hold together in the face of economic collapse, political violence, and the rise of extremist ideologies. For many Germans, it was a time of anger and desperation, a time when old values were dying and new, dangerous ones were taking root. In the midst of this storm, Rundstedt remained largely untouched. His loyalty to the military and its traditions unwavering, despite the turbulence around him. He was a man of duty, not politics, and he knew that the army, the institution to which he had devoted his life, would be the one constant in a country torn apart by its own failures. Rundstedt's focus was not on the political struggles of the day. He had lived through the ideological warfare of World War I and knew that political games were best left to the politicians. His world was one of military discipline, of strategy, and of professionalism, and he clung to it desperately, even as the country around him seemed to fall apart. Despite the political turmoil, Rundstedt's position as a senior officer in the Weimar military meant he was crucial to maintaining some semblance of order. But the storm was coming. Adolf Hitler, a man who had spent his early years on the fringes of politics, was rising fast, promising to restore Germany to its former glory. Rundstedt, ever the professional soldier, was well aware of the growing influence of the Nazi Party, but he refused to become a part of it. He had no time for Hitler's rhetoric, nor the dangerous ideology that he was selling to the masses. Rundstedt, at his core, was a soldier, not a political pawn. But the rise of Hitler was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. The Nazi Party's rise created a dilemma for Rundstedt, as it did for many senior officers of the Reichswehr, the post-World War I German military. The army was in disarray, reduced to a mere shadow of its former self under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, but it still carried the weight of its former glory. Rundstedt had no love for the Nazis, but he could not ignore the reality that Hitler and his movement were becoming a force that could not be easily dismissed. Hitler was promising a military revival, and the army, so long emasculated by the Allies, was desperate for the restoration of its former strength. Rundstedt's distaste for the Nazi ideology was personal, grounded in his professional sense of duty. To him, Hitler's promises of grandeur and conquest came at the cost of professionalism, of military integrity. Rundstedt was a man who had seen the devastating consequences of misguided ideology during World War I, and he knew that blind loyalty to a charismatic leader could lead only to ruin. The military should be about discipline, order, and efficiency, not political posturing. He was skeptical of the Nazis' ability to understand and manage the complexities of modern warfare, and he certainly didn't share their fervor for racial purity or nationalistic rhetoric. But Rundstedt had no choice but to remain within the military structure, for the future of Germany's defense depended on the army's ability to function. Throughout the early years of Nazi rule, Rundstedt kept a cautious distance from Hitler's growing political influence. He refused to join the Nazi Party, avoiding the public spectacles and the party loyalty oaths that so many of his contemporaries had succumbed to. He also steered clear of the Nazi rallies and the parades of power that glorified Hitler's personal cult. To Rundstedt, the military was above such things. It was the professional institution that had survived wars, revolutions, and defeats, and it must remain free of the poisonous influence of ideology. Yet despite his disdain for the Nazis and their movement, Rundstedt's position as a senior officer in the Weimar military meant that he could not afford to remain completely aloof. The army's leadership was increasingly being influenced by the political winds, and Rundstedt's own survival within the military depended on his ability to navigate these waters. As Hitler's grip on power tightened, the army became more and more intertwined with his ambitions. Rundstedt, pragmatic as ever, chose to play the role of the disinterested professional, supporting the rebuilding of Germany's military power, but never fully embracing the Nazi cause. It was this pragmatism that allowed Rundstedt to survive. He had the respect of the military establishment and the ear of his superiors, and his experience and professionalism were too valuable to be easily discarded. But even as Rundstedt continued to hold fast to his professional standards, the reality was clear. The army would soon be forced to bow to the political realities of the new regime. Rundstedt's loyalty would be to the military, not to any political party or individual leader. But in the world of Nazi Germany, loyalty to the military meant serving a regime that was increasingly driven by Hitler's vision. Rundstedt's role in the Weimar military would evolve, but his distance from the Nazi Party would never change. He would remain an outsider, a man who belonged to a different era, a professional soldier trapped between the legacy of Imperial Germany and the dark storm that Hitler had unleashed on Europe. Yet, despite his growing distaste for the political climate, Rundstedt would find himself drawn back into the center of the Nazi war machine, forced to reconcile his duty with his disdain for the man who had come to embody Germany's future. As the country crumbled under the weight of political violence and economic collapse, Rundstedt remained a soldier above all else, refusing to let the chaos of the Weimar Republic or the rise of the Nazi regime sway him from his professional calling. But the storm was coming, and the future of the German military and its commanders would be forever linked to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Rundstedt had survived the Weimar storm, but the true test of his loyalty and survival had only just begun. Germany's wounds from the Great War were still fresh when Adolf Hitler ascended to power in 1933. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the once proud German military of its strength, its dignity, and its place in the world. But in the wake of this humiliation, a new Germany was rising, forged from the rubble by Hitler's vision. As the country began to rearm, the military found itself in desperate need of skilled leadership, commanders who could mold a broken army into something feared once again. Despite the growing storm of ideology and political manipulation, Gerd von Rundstedt found himself swept into the Nazi war machine. Rundstedt's decision to remain in the military, despite the Nazis' growing control over Germany, was one driven by professional duty, not political allegiance. He was a soldier, not a politician, and he saw his mission as preserving the strength and discipline of the army, the institution that had been his life. His personal disdain for Hitler's ideology and the ruthless political maneuvers of the Nazi Party were clear. Rundstedt had no love for the man behind the uniform, the very symbol of nationalist fervor and racial purity that had overtaken Germany. But in the chaos of post-Versailles Germany, Rundstedt recognized the brutal truth. The military's survival depended on playing along with the Nazis' agenda, at least for a time. As the Nazi Party tightened its grip on Germany, Rundstedt knew that disengagement from the regime would mean professional suicide. The officer corps, many of whom had endured the painful aftershocks of defeat in World War I, found themselves caught between loyalty to the military tradition and the necessity of serving under Hitler. Rundstedt, ever pragmatic, chose survival. He aligned himself with the professional military elite, even as he maintained his deep-seated resentment of Hitler and the Nazi political system. Over time, Rundstedt rose through the ranks. His reputation as a methodical strategist and adept administrator made him an invaluable asset as Germany began to rearm, defying the terms of the Versailles Treaty. His ability to organize and rebuild Germany's military apparatus, to mold it into a force that could match the ambitions of the Führer, made him a key player in the Nazi regime's military plans. Rundstedt would never publicly embrace the Nazi ideology, but his professionalism and military expertise made him one of the most respected and feared officers in the new Wehrmacht. The army that he helped to rebuild would soon be put to the test in ways he could never have imagined. But as Rundstedt climbed, so too did the moral cost of remaining in service. The loyalty to his country and its military that once seemed pure had now become entangled with the tyranny that Hitler had brought to power. Rundstedt's service in the military had never been about politics, but now, as the Nazi war machine gained momentum, it became increasingly difficult to separate the two. He had chosen duty, but he was now bound to a regime that demanded blind obedience to a man he neither respected nor trusted. In the fall of 1939, the vision that Hitler had long harbored for a reasserted German empire began to unfold. The invasion of Poland marked the first significant act of aggression in what would become the Second World War, and Gerd von Rundstedt found himself at the center of it. The polished professionalism that had served him well in peacetime would now face its ultimate test. Rundstedt was tasked with commanding Army Group South, one of the two massive formations that would sweep across Poland, obliterating the country's defenses and securing its territory before the Allies could respond. It was an operation that required precision, speed, and a cold, calculated application of force. And Rundstedt, as always, delivered. The German forces moved with a speed that stunned the world. The Polish army, despite its bravery, was overwhelmed. Rundstedt's forces, supported by tanks, aircraft, and a well-coordinated blitzkrieg, tore through the Polish defenses with terrifying efficiency. By the end of September 1939, Poland was no more, swallowed by the might of the German army. Rundstedt's success was undeniable. His reputation as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable generals solidified. He had helped deliver a swift and crushing victory, securing his place in the ranks of Germany's military elite. But as the victory celebrations died down, something began to gnaw at Rundstedt. As he had led the campaign, he had become increasingly aware of the atrocities being committed by the SS and other Nazi units that followed in the wake of the German advance. Mass executions, forced deportations, and the systematic elimination of Poland's Jewish population were not hidden from him. Rundstedt had spent his entire life in the military, dedicated to the principles of order and professionalism. But now he found himself face to face with the horrific consequences of the regime he had chosen to serve. Though Rundstedt was not a part of the SS, and though he did not directly participate in the atrocities, he could not escape his knowledge of them. His moral compass had never been so challenged. Should he speak out against the violence, risking everything for the sake of what he knew was right? Or should he stay silent, keep his head down, and accept the reality that the Nazi regime had made his military service a political act, one inextricably tied to their genocidal goals? Rundstedt had always been a man of duty, and he had always believed that his responsibility was to his army, his men, and the success of their campaigns. But now, the nature of that duty was changing. The moral dilemma he faced was as overwhelming as the battlefields he commanded. On one hand, Rundstedt could remain silent and preserve his career, maintaining the loyalty of his men and his position in the Nazi war machine. On the other hand, he knew that to defy the regime meant risking everything he had built, the respect, the position, and the professionalism he had worked so hard to cultivate. Hitler's Germany was not a place for dissenters. There were no second chances for those who opposed the state. In the end, Rundstedt chose what he knew best. He remained silent, unable to act on his disgust for the atrocities, but equally unwilling to compromise his professional duty. As Rundstedt watched the war unfold, the tension between his loyalty to the military and the moral compromises of his service only deepened. Poland was a victory, but it was also a moment that marked the beginning of the unraveling of his own soul. He had won battles, but the cost of those victories was now clearer than ever. The atrocities that accompanied his army's advance could not be ignored, and the line between the military he had served all his life and the political horrors of the Nazi regime was becoming increasingly difficult to discern. Rundstedt's role in the invasion of Poland would be remembered as a military success, but for him, it marked the beginning of a personal conflict that would stay with him for the rest of the war. He had been a soldier, yes, but at what cost? The war was far from over, and Rundstedt's decisions would continue to define not only the fate of his country but also his own moral reckoning. Victory was within reach. The Germans had pushed the British and French forces to the brink. The retreating Allied soldiers cornered at Dunkirk. The sea stretched before them, the only escape route, but the German forces were poised to finish the job. A single final push and the Allied forces would be crushed, their ability to fight on the Western Front shattered. It was the moment of triumph, the end of the British Expeditionary Force. Yet, in that pivotal moment, Gerd von Rundstedt, ever the cautious strategist, raised a question that no one else dared to ask. The German army was moving fast, and the tanks had penetrated the Allied lines. The Luftwaffe was primed for its assault. The victory seemed inevitable, but Rundstedt, known for his methodical and precise nature, warned against pushing forward too quickly. His voice cut through the eager enthusiasm of his fellow officers. The ground ahead was marshy, unsuitable for a full armored advance. The infantry was stretched thin, and the tanks, though successful, had outrun their supply lines. Rundstedt advised a pause, a moment to regroup, to consolidate, and to avoid overextending their forces. He knew that military history was full of examples where impulsive moves at the moment of victory had led to disaster. It was a difficult decision, one that seemed to defy the natural instinct to finish the job. But Rundstedt's caution had always been his trademark. The decision came down from Hitler: halt the advance. The halt order was issued, and German forces stopped short, giving the Allies the time they needed to organize a miraculous evacuation. Over the course of 9 days, more than 300,000 soldiers were rescued from Dunkirk, escaping to fight another day. For Rundstedt, the victory that should have been his felt like a hollow one. The evacuation at Dunkirk became a symbol of British resolve, a rallying cry for the Allied forces. And for Rundstedt, the question remained: had he been right to halt the advance, or had he handed the Allies a lifeline when victory was within their grasp? In private, Rundstedt would later admit that the halt order was a mistake. The final victory had been within reach, but the moment had passed. The opportunity was gone, and with it, so was any hope of completely defeating the British. The decision haunted him, the question of what could have been lingering in the back of his mind for years to come. Dunkirk would always remain the one moment when the course of history might have changed with just a single push. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union loomed ahead, a vast, frozen wilderness, its immensity both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Operation Barbarossa was about to begin, and the German army, now rebuilt under Hitler's command, was poised to strike the heart of Russia. For Gerd von Rundstedt, this would be the greatest test of his military career. The operation called for a three-pronged attack on Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, with Rundstedt commanding Army Group South, tasked with driving through Ukraine and into the oil-rich Caucasus. The stakes were enormous. A successful campaign would provide Germany with the resources it desperately needed to fuel the war machine. The Soviet Union would be crushed, and the Third Reich would dominate Europe. But as the invasion unfolded, Rundstedt's worst fears began to materialize. The distances were staggering, the logistics a nightmare. The supply lines were stretched to their limits, and the Germans had underestimated the sheer size and resilience of the Soviet Union. As his forces advanced deeper into Russian territory, Rundstedt's concerns mounted. He could see the overextension of the German army. The rapid advance that had worked in Poland and France was now a liability in the vastness of Russia. Rundstedt knew that the German forces could not sustain the momentum. The farther they advanced, the more vulnerable their lines became. Winter was coming, and German soldiers were ill-equipped to handle the brutal cold. Vehicles froze, ammunition ran low, and food supplies became a growing issue. Rundstedt urged caution, advised consolidating the gains they had made and preparing for a long, drawn-out campaign. Hitler, however, would not hear it. He demanded that the advance continue without pause, that the push to capture Moscow be relentless. Rundstedt knew that continuing without proper logistics or time to rest the troops would lead to disaster, but his advice was ignored. As the Soviets launched counterattacks, the German army was caught in a grip of exhaustion, facing the very real possibility of a catastrophic defeat. The invasion, which had begun with such promise, was quickly spiraling into an untenable situation. The Eastern Front was proving to be the graveyard of German ambitions, and Rundstedt's worst fears had come true. The winter of 1941 had shattered the dreams of a quick victory in Russia, and as 1942 dawned, Hitler was unwilling to accept the truth. The Soviet Union would not collapse as quickly as he had hoped. Rundstedt, ever the realist, could see the writing on the wall. The German forces were spread too thin, their supply lines too stretched to support the massive push required to conquer Stalingrad. By the time Stalingrad had become a symbol of German overreach, Rundstedt's patience had worn thin. Hitler's demands to hold the city no matter the cost came with heavy casualties, and the surrounding forces were left vulnerable. Rundstedt made the decision to order a retreat from Rostov, recognizing that holding the position was not just impractical, it was suicidal. This was the moment that would define Rundstedt's future. He had defied Hitler's orders for the first time in his career. Retreat was unthinkable to Hitler, who viewed it as a betrayal, the very antithesis of Nazi ideology. For Rundstedt, however, the decision was clear. Survival of the army mattered more than pride or ideology. The retreat was necessary to preserve what was left of the German fighting force. Rundstedt's decision cost him his command. He was relieved of his post, dismissed from service, and sent into temporary retirement. But as the war continued and Hitler's plans continued to falter, the call for Rundstedt's return came. He was brought back into service, once again expected to serve the very regime that had so harshly punished him. By 1944, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allied invasion of Normandy had begun, and D-Day was a shock to the German command. Rundstedt, now in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall, knew the situation was hopeless. The German army was exhausted, its resources depleted, and the Allied forces were too numerous, too well supplied, and too determined to be stopped. Rundstedt's role was now one of damage control, but even he knew that the Third Reich was doomed. The Atlantic Wall, the massive network of coastal defenses built to repel an invasion, was a propaganda tool, not a viable defense. Rundstedt was given responsibility over it, but his authority was limited by the interference of Hitler, who insisted on maintaining personal control over key military decisions. As the Allies landed at Normandy, Rundstedt's forces were left in disarray, unable to act decisively as Hitler's approval was delayed. As the Germans scrambled to react to the invasion, Rundstedt's frustration mounted. Missed opportunities and inability to command freely doomed any chance of success. By the time Hitler ordered his final counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, Rundstedt knew the war was over. His forces were already worn thin, and the German army, outmanned and outgunned, could never recover. Rundstedt was forced to play a role in Hitler's last desperate gamble, knowing full well that it was futile. The operation failed, and the final collapse of the German Reich was imminent. Rundstedt had played his part, but it was now clear that the future of Germany was not his to shape. The war was lost, and Rundstedt's legacy, like the Third Reich itself, was already sealed.